Hi, this is Matt Baker. Today we are finally heading to Middle-earth, where I'll be showing you a family tree containing several characters from the new series, The Rings of Power. However, I'll also be showing you how those characters connect to the characters from the original Lord of the Rings trilogy. Finally, I'm going to talk about Tolkien's world in general, so that you can get a better idea of why Middle-earth is filled with so many different types of people, ranging from elves and wizards to dwarves and hobbits. But before we begin, let me mention two things. First, there aren't going to be any major show spoilers in this video, as I won't be going through what happens in each episode. However, I will be talking about the history of Middle-earth in general, so there might be a few very basic things that could be seen as being spoilers for those who are complete newbies to Tolkien. Second, for those who know a lot about the Tolkienverse, you're probably going to find my chart to be quite oversimplified. As you know, this tree could be at least 10 times bigger, but for the sake of practicality, I've had to simplify things a bit. Okay, with that said, let's start by talking about the elves, as they play a very central role in the Rings of Power. The first thing you need to know is that almost all the elves in the show are Noldor elves. The Noldor are one of the three main groups of elves in Tolkien's world, the other two being the Vanyar and the Teleri. The first High King of the Noldor was Finwë, and he was initially married to another Noldor elf named Miriel. But Miriel basically lost her will to live after giving birth to Feanor and ended up dying, which is something quite rare for an elf, because elves are basically immortal unless they die in battle. Finwë therefore married for a second time to Indis, who was a Vanyar elf. With her, he had Fingolfin, Finarfin, and a few other children. Finarfin was the father of Finrod and Galadriel, who are the first two characters we meet in The Rings of Power. Galadriel, of course, showed up in the original movies, played by a different actress. But in this show, she's going to be a more central character. In episode 1, we also meet some more elves, including Gil-galad, Celebrimbor, and Elrond, all of whom are related to Galadriel in more distant ways. Earlier, I mentioned Feanor, the firstborn child of Finwë. He became a great craftsman and created a set of 3 jewels called the Silmarils. The novel, The Silmarillion, which is sort of a prequel to The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, tells the story of these jewels and how they were stolen by the evil Lord Morgoth, who we'll talk about in a bit. However, when the Rings of Power starts, Feanor is long dead, and it is now his grandson, Celebrimbor, who is the main elven craftsman. In fact, he's the one who will go on to make the famous rings that will be central to the show, and of course, were central to the movies The Lord of the Rings. Gil-galad is the current High King of the Noldor elves. In the Silmarillion, he's said to be the grandson of Fingolfin, and therefore Galadriel's first cousin once removed. However, according to Christopher Tolkien, who edited his father J.R.R. Tolkien's works, Gil-galad was actually the son of Orodreth, and therefore a grandnephew to Galadriel. Either way, it doesn't actually impact the story. Elrond's parentage is much more interesting. He's actually a half-elf, which is why he's shown on this chart in green rather than yellow. And it's at this point that I should introduce the humans. Originally, there were 3 great houses of men, Beor, Haleth, and Hador. In the entire history of Middle-earth, elves and humans married only 3 times. The first union was between Beren from the house of Beor and Luthien, a Teleri elf. Together, they had a son named Dior, who had a daughter named Elwing. The second union was between Tuor from the house of Hador and Idril, a Noldor elf closely related to Gil-galad. They had a son named Eärendil, who was a great seafarer and who married Elwing. Together, they had Elrond and his brother Elros. Elrond also showed up in the original movies, again played by a different actor. By that point, he had married Galadriel's daughter, Celebrian, but so far in the Rings of Power, Celebrian does not appear, nor does Galadriel's husband, Celeborn. Elros doesn't appear in the show either, but a painting of him does. He's important when it comes to the overall history of Middle-earth. You see, half-elves can choose to live as elves or as humans. Elrond chose to remain an elf, but Elros chose to become a human. He founded the kingdom of Númenor and became its first king. Númenor is the place where most of the humans are living at the start of the Rings of Power. It's actually a star-shaped island located to the southwest of Middle-earth. In the Rings of Power, the king of Númenor is now a man named Tar Palantir, a distant descendant of Elros. Remember, elves are basically immortal, so while Elros is long dead, Elrond is still alive. However, Palantir is old and unwell, and therefore his daughter Muriel is serving as queen regent. But also on the scene is her cousin, Ar-Pharazôn, who has his own ambitions. And then there's Elendil and his son Isildur. To explain who they are, we have to look back in the tree to a significant event that occurred early on in the history of Númenor. The fourth king's firstborn was a daughter named Silmarien. She was overlooked for the throne in favor of her younger brother, Tar-Meneldor, and therefore her descendants went on to hold the title Lord of Andúnië instead. Eventually, the kings of Númenor became more and more influenced by evil, but the lords of Andúnië did not, and therefore they became secretly known as the leaders of the faithful. Now, before I continue with the rest of the chart, I have to stop and ask you, when watching shows like this, have you ever wished that you too could become a lord or lady? Well, you're in luck, because thanks to today's sponsor, Established Titles, you can do exactly that. Just go to establishedtitles.com/usefulcharts or use the link in the description or pinned comment. No, you don't get to live in Middle-earth, and no, you don't even get to rub shoulders with King Charles III. But here's what you do get. You get to buy a small plot of land in Scotland, a souvenir plot to be exact. And therefore, based on a very old tradition, you also get this fancy certificate declaring that you have now earned the honorific title of Lord. But here's the best part. In the first episode of The Rings of Power, we learned that the elves used to have two very beautiful trees, but that sadly those trees were destroyed. Well, for every person that buys a souvenir plot through Established Titles, they will make sure that a tree will be planted on your behalf. They work with global charities like One Tree Planted and Trees for the Future, and because of this, were named Best Green Business in Scotland in 2021. Once again, you can find the link in the description or pinned comment. Use the code USEFULCHARTS to get 10% off. Okay, so far we've talked about elves and humans. Well, what about the dwarves? To explain how they fit into things, let's now go back to the very beginning. In Tolkien's world, God is known as Ilúvatar, and it was his plan to create two races of children for Earth, elves and men. The elves were born first, so they are known as the firstborn, whereas the men who came later are known as the afterborn. However, prior to creating Earth and its children, Ilúvatar also created various spirit beings to help him to do the work of creation. These spirits were known as the Ainur, or Holy Ones. Chief among the Ainur were the Valar, but there were also lesser spirits known as the Maiar. One of the Valar, named Ale, got impatient and started to create some beings without Ilúvatar's permission. These were the dwarves. However, when Ilúvatar found out, he agreed to let them be born, but only after the elves. Therefore, the dwarves were forced to sleep until the elves were created. In the Rings of Power, the main dwarven king is Durin III, ruler of the underground city Khazad-dûm. His son, the crown prince, is Doran IV, and he is married to Princess Disa. What about hobbits then? Are they related to the dwarves? Well, no. Although their exact origins are not made clear, they are actually related to humans. Somehow they just became much shorter. In the Rings of Power, the hobbits are known as Harfoots, and basically the Harfoots you see in the show are the direct ancestors of the later hobbits we meet in The Lord of the Rings. Let's now go back to the Valar and Maiar. Most of the Valar were good, but one ended up becoming very, very bad. That was Melkor, who later became known as Morgoth, kind of like how Lucifer is said to have become Satan. Anyway, Morgoth killed Finwë and a bunch of other elves and men before finally being defeated and permanently banished from Earth. However, the evil that he introduced to Earth remained, and one of his most trusted followers, Sauron, took on the role as the new Dark Lord and continued to create orcs to serve as his army. Note that Sauron is actually one of the Maiar, who, as I mentioned earlier, are slightly less powerful than the Valar. However, keep in mind that Gandalf and other such wizards are Maiar too, which is why they can do so many magical things. Both Gandalf and Sauron end up appearing in the Ring of Power, but I won't tell you exactly how, as it's a bit of a surprise. Okay, the final thing I want to do is show you how the current series connects to the previous Lord of the Rings movies. This is a bit of a spoiler if you are brand new to the Tolkienverse. So if you want absolutely zero potential spoilers, you can stop watching now. But if you're at all familiar with Tolkien's books, you probably know that at some point Numenor is going to be destroyed. That doesn't happen in Season 1 of The Rings of Power, and it is unclear exactly when it will occur, but at some point it definitely will. We know from the general history of Middle-earth that after the fall of Numenor, Elendil and his two sons, Isildur and Anarion, end up settling in Middle-earth, where they establish two kingdoms known as Arnor and Gondor. The kings of Arnor descend from Isildur, whereas the kings of Gondor descend from Anarion. Eventually, though, Arnor divides into three smaller kingdoms, and then each of those smaller kingdoms ceases to exist. However, the last king of the kingdom of Arthedain marries a princess from Gondor, and their descendants become known as the chieftains of the Dunedain, the word Dunedain referring to the descendants of the Númenóreans. Gondor eventually runs out of kings, at which point power is transferred to those who hold the role of steward. During the time when The Lord of the Rings is set, a man named Denethor is now the steward of Gondor, and early on we meet two of his sons, Faramir and Boromir. However, we also meet a man named Aragorn, who we later learn is chieftain of the Dunedain, and therefore the true heir to the throne of Gondor. In the end, he ends up marrying Arwen, who is the daughter of Elrond, and also the granddaughter of Galadriel. So the whole thing ends up being tied together quite nicely. Okay, so that was a look at the family tree of the Rings of Power. Let me know in the comments what you think of the show so far and where you think it's heading. Thanks for watching.